Pilot questions Barron Trump's presence on private jet. What happens next stuns everyone. Have you ever faced a moment where someone judged you purely on appearances without knowing who you really are? Imagine being underestimated, dismissed, and humiliated, only to reveal your true identity at just the right time. Today, I'm sharing a story that will leave you speechless. It's about a young man, quiet, yet composed, who was treated unfairly by someone blinded by their own arrogance. Little did they know, they were dealing with someone far beyond their assumptions. Before we dive into this gripping tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I bring you powerful stories like this every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss a single one. Now let's get into it. The roar of jet engines hummed faintly in the background as a sleek private jet stood poised on the tarmac, bathed in the warm golden light of a late afternoon. The boarding process had been a flurry of efficiency, executives, celebrities and dignitaries quietly slipping aboard, each cloaked in an air of importance. Amid the polished shoes and tailored suits, a lone figure stood out. Barron Trump, dressed in a plain navy hoodie and well-worn sneakers, stepped out of the black car that had discreetly pulled up near the jet. At 16, his tall, lanky frame seemed to carry an unassuming confidence. His eyes, sharp and observant, darted around the bustling airport, scanning his surroundings with a mix of curiosity and weariness. He carried only a simple leather backpack slung over one shoulder. The strap creaked softly under the weight of its contents, books perhaps, or a tablet. His fingers gripped it tightly, betraying a hint of unease. Unlike the other passengers, he made no attempt to seek attention or project an air of wealth. Instead, he exuded a quiet self-assurance, a trait honed from years of being in the public eye, yet yearning for anonymity. The flight attendant, a woman named Claudia, noticed him first. Her practiced smile faltered ever so slightly as her eyes scanned his casual attire. He didn't fit the profile of the jet's usual clientele. She stepped forward, her polished heels clicking on the tarmac, and greeted him with professional politeness. "Good afternoon, young man. May I see your boarding credentials?" she asked, her tone warm but curious. Barron met her gaze without flinching. His voice, deep for his age but calm, responded evenly, "It's already been arranged." Claudia hesitated, sensing something unusual but unable to place it. There was a gravity in the boy's demeanor, an unspoken authority that made her pause. Yet his appearance was so unassuming that she couldn't reconcile it with the high-profile passengers she was used to. "Of course," she said, stepping aside. "Please, make yourself comfortable." Barron nodded, offering a faint smile of gratitude. He climbed the short staircase into the aircraft, his steps measured, almost reluctant. Inside the cabin, the soft hum of luxury surrounded him, plush leather seats, polished wooden panels, and the faint scent of expensive cologne. He chose a seat near the back, away from the other passengers, and settled in with a quiet sigh. As the minutes ticked by, Claudia couldn't shake the sense that there was more to the boy than met the eye. She observed him from a distance, noting how he carried himself, not with the arrogance of privilege, but with the poise of someone used to scrutiny. He sat with his back straight, his hands resting lightly on his lap, his gaze occasionally drifting to the window where the sun dipped lower in the sky. Barron remained silent, his presence subdued but oddly commanding. Other passengers glanced his way, some with faint curiosity, but most dismissed him as an anomaly, a teenager out of place in a world of wealth and power. In truth, Barron preferred it that way. He had grown up surrounded by the glare of cameras and the whispers of judgment, yet he never let it define him. Here, in the insulated quiet of the jet's cabin, he found a fleeting moment of solace. He reached into his backpack, pulling out a leather-bound notebook. Its pages were filled with sketches and notes, reflections from someone far older than his years. He flipped through them idly, his mind wandering. Outside, the sun dipped further, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The cabin door remained open as the final preparations for takeoff continued. The faint bustle of the airport seeped in, a reminder of the chaos beyond this temporary sanctuary. Barron closed his notebook, leaning back into his seat with a quiet exhale. Unbeknownst to him, his presence on the jet was about to stir questions and assumptions that would ripple far beyond this flight. For now, though, he savored the stillness, unaware that his identity, so carefully concealed, was on the verge of being thrust into the spotlight once again. The jet's cabin was filled with the faint hum of the air conditioning system as the last pre-flight checks were underway. The other passengers were engrossed in their own worlds, reading newspapers, typing on sleek laptops, or engaging in hushed conversations. None paid much attention to the quiet boy seated at the rear of the cabin, his head tilted slightly as he gazed out the window. The serenity was interrupted when Captain Roger Hayes, the pilot, entered the cabin. A man in his late 40s, with a rigid posture and a sharp uniform, he exuded an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. Hayes was well regarded in his field, but those who worked with him knew him as someone who could be quick to judge and dismissive of those he deemed unworthy of the luxury his passengers usually embodied. As his eyes scanned the cabin, they landed on Barron. His brows furrowed almost imperceptibly, the casual hoodie and sneakers clashing sharply with the designer suits and polished shoes surrounding him. Hayes paused, his mind already drawing conclusions. "What's this?" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Claudia, the flight attendant, to hear. His tone was tinged with disbelief and disdain. Claudia turned to him, her expression neutral. "That's one of our passengers, Captain. Everything's in order." Hayes snorted softly, shaking his head. "Doesn't look like he belongs here," he said, his voice low but dripping with condescension. "What's a kid like that doing on a jet like this? Did someone's assistant forget to notify security?" Claudia hesitated. "He said his arrangements were already made. I didn't see any reason to question him." Hayes's lips pressed into a thin line as he glanced back at Barron, who was now flipping through the pages of his notebook, seemingly unaware of the scrutiny. To Hayes, it didn't matter that the boy was quiet and composed. All he saw was someone who didn't fit, someone who, by all appearances, didn't belong in a world of wealth and exclusivity. "Let me handle this," Hayes said, brushing past Claudia. Hayes approached Barron with deliberate steps, his polished shoes clicking against the plush carpeting. The sound broke through the quiet, drawing a few glances from nearby passengers. When he reached Barron's seat, he stopped, folding his arms across his chest. "Excuse me," Hayes began, his voice firm. Barron looked up, his calm gaze meeting the pilot's. Hayes noted the boy's steady demeanor, but it only irritated him further. "You seem to be in the wrong place." Barron tilted his head slightly, his expression neutral. "I don't think so," he replied evenly, his voice polite but unyielding. Hayes raised an eyebrow, his tone taking on a sharper edge. "This is a private jet. We don't allow unaccompanied passengers without proper authorization. You'll need to explain yourself." Barron remained calm, his voice steady. "I'm authorized to be here. Everything's been arranged." The pilot's eyes narrowed, his disbelief evident. "By whom? Who exactly arranged this for you?" Barron hesitated, clearly unwilling to elaborate. His silence only fueled Hayes's assumptions. The captain straightened, his expression hardening. "Listen, kid, we don't have time for games. You're not fooling anyone with that story. If you don't have proof, I'll have to ask you to leave." The words, though delivered in a controlled tone, carried an undeniable weight of disdain. Hayes wasn't just questioning Barron's presence, he was outright dismissing him as an impostor. Claudia stepped forward, her voice measured. "Captain Hayes, perhaps we should double-check with the ground staff. He seems confident that his presence here is legitimate." Hayes shot her a look that silenced her immediately. "No need," he snapped. "I've seen this before. Someone trying to sneak into places they don't belong. It's not happening on my watch." Barron watched the exchange without flinching. His composed exterior gave nothing away, but his fingers tightened around the edge of his notebook. He met Hayes's gaze, his voice calm but firm. I'm not leaving." The defiance in Barron's tone seemed to strike a nerve. Hayes leaned in slightly, his voice lowering but losing none of its sharpness. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, kid. You don't look like someone who belongs here." The remark hung in the air, heavy with implication. Barron didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate. "What are you doing?" Hayes demanded, his irritation giving way to suspicion. Barron looked up, his expression unreadable. "Calling my father," he said simply. The casual statement caught Hayes off guard. For a moment, the captain hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. Then, as if convincing himself that the boy was bluffing, he shook his head. "Go ahead," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "Let's see who picks up." As Barron tapped the screen, Hayes turned to Claudia, his expression smug. "This should be good," he muttered. The cabin fell silent, all eyes now on the boy who seemed to carry himself with a calm defiance that didn't match his appearance. Barron brought the phone to his ear, his voice low and steady as he spoke into it. "Dad, there's a problem. They don't believe I'm supposed to be here." The quiet confidence in his tone sent a ripple through the cabin. Hayes's smugness faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. Claudia's brow furrowed as she exchanged a glance with the other staff. Something about the boy's demeanor suddenly felt real. As the conversation continued, Hayes' confidence began to waver. His assumptions, so firmly rooted a moment ago, now seemed less certain. And as Barron ended the call, his calm gaze fixed on the pilot, Hayes couldn't shake the growing sense that he had made a grave mistake. Barron lowered the phone slowly, slipping it back into his backpack with unhurried precision. His movements were deliberate, almost as if he were savoring the anticipation of what would come next. Yet his face betrayed nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, only an eerie calm that unsettled even Claudia, who had been silently rooting for him. Captain Hayes, however, stood firm, his arms still crossed tightly over his chest. The boy's display, his calm demeanor, his apparent confidence, only fueled Hayes's irritation. To him it was nothing more than an act, a feeble attempt to gain leverage where none existed. "Nice try," Hayes sneered, taking a step closer to Barron, "but I don't have time for childish games. You can call whoever you want, but unless you show me some proof of your so-called authorization, you'll be stepping off this jet before we take off." The words were sharp, cutting, and laced with unmistakable disdain. Hayes leaned in slightly, his shadow falling over Barron, as if to assert dominance. The other passengers, sensing the rising tension, cast furtive glances toward the scene. Most said nothing, their disinterest or discomfort keeping them silent, but their expression spoke volumes. They, too, doubted the boy's legitimacy. Barron sat back in his seat, unfazed by the pilot's towering presence. His long fingers tapped idly against the armrest, a rhythm that seemed to underscore his unshaken composure. "I've already made the call," he said quietly, his voice even and resolute. "You'll see soon enough." Hayes chuckled derisively, the sound cold and humorless. "Oh, I'm sure I will," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He straightened, his piercing gaze sweeping over the boy as though trying to find cracks in the calm facade. "Let me guess, you're calling Daddy to come rescue you from the big bad pilot? Hate to break it to you, kid, but that trick doesn't work here." Claudia, who had been standing a few feet away, shifted uncomfortably. Her instincts told her there was more to Barron than met the eye, but Hayes's authority and his sharp tongue kept her silent. She bit her lip, torn between stepping in and letting the situation unfold. "Captain, perhaps—" she began, but Hayes cut her off with a raised hand. "No, Claudia," he snapped. "This needs to be handled properly. We can't have just anyone waltzing onto a private jet, claiming they belong here. Rules are rules." He turned back to Barron, his voice hardening further. "You understand what rules are, don't you?" Barron's lips twitched slightly, not quite a smile, but enough to suggest he had caught the thinly veiled insult. He said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them, his steady gaze a quiet challenge. The tension was palpable, thick enough to make even the most disengaged passengers take notice. A man in a tailored suit whispered something to his companion, his eyes flickering toward Barron with a mix of curiosity and amusement. Another passenger, a woman with a diamond necklace that sparkled even in the dim cabin light, shook her head slightly, her disapproval plain. "What's the hold-up?" she muttered loudly enough for Hayes to hear. "If he doesn't belong, just remove him. Honestly, some people have no shame." Her words landed like a slap, but Barron didn't react. Instead, he reached for his notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. He pulled a pen from the spiral binding and began to sketch, his movements slow and deliberate. To anyone watching, it was as though he had tuned out the room entirely. Hayes's jaw tightened at the boy's indifference. "You think this is funny?" he asked, his voice low but seething. "You think you can just sit here and ignore me?" Barron didn't look up. "I think," he said evenly, "you're wasting time." The audacity of the response left Hayes momentarily speechless. His face flushed, the color rising from his neck to his cheeks. The quiet murmurs of the other passengers grew louder, a ripple of tension spreading through the cabin. Claudia took a step forward, her voice soft but firm. "Captain Hayes," she said, her tone more assertive now, "perhaps we should verify his story before escalating things further. If he's truly unauthorized, security can handle it." Hayes shot her a glare, his authority clearly threatened by her suggestion. "I don't need security to tell me what's obvious," he snapped. "Look at him. Does he look like someone who belongs on this jet? You've worked in this industry long enough to know the type of clientele we serve." Claudia stiffened, her professionalism warring with her sense of fairness. "Appearances can be deceiving, Captain." Hayes barked a short, bitter laugh. "Not this time." Outside, the faint sound of approaching vehicles broke through the tension. The deep rumble of engines grew louder, drawing closer, until the unmistakable gleam of black SUVs appeared through the cabin's windows. Hayes glanced toward the sound, his frown deepening. The passengers, too, turned their heads, their murmurs growing more curious. Barron closed his notebook and set it aside, his movements unhurried. For the first time, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Told you," he said quietly. The words were calm, almost nonchalant, but they carried a weight that sent a chill down Hayes's spine. He turned back to Barron, his irritation now tinged with unease. "What did you do?" Hayes demanded, his voice losing some of its edge. Barron leaned back in his seat, his gaze steady. "I made a call," he said simply. "You'll see." As the first SUV came to a stop near the jet, its darkened windows reflecting the setting sun, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. Hayes's confidence faltered, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. He had pushed too far, and the consequences were fast approaching. The faint hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade as the rumble of engines outside grew louder. All eyes in the cabin turned toward the windows as the sleek convoy of black SUVs came to a halt on the tarmac. Their glossy surfaces reflected the golden glow of the setting sun, an unspoken promise of authority and power. Captain Hayes stood frozen, his chest tightening as the doors of the lead vehicle opened. His mind raced, struggling to connect the boy sitting calmly in the cabin to the imposing figures now stepping out of the SUVs. Dressed in tailored black suits, their earpieces glinting under the fading sunlight, the men moved with purpose. Secret Service agents, unmistakable in their precision and poise. Barron remained seated, his posture relaxed, but his eyes flickered toward the windows. There was no smugness in his expression, only a quiet acceptance of the inevitability of what was unfolding. He reached for his backpack, pulling it onto his lap, and waited. The cabin door opened with a soft hiss as one of the agents stepped inside. His sharp gaze swept over the passengers before settling on Barron. The agent's demeanor shifted immediately, his posture straightening as he addressed the boy. "Mr. Trump," he said, his voice steady and respectful, "your father asked us to escort you." The cabin went silent. The title, Mr. Trump, landed like a thunderclap, sending a ripple of shock through the room. Claudia's eyes widened as realization dawned on her. She glanced at Barron, the weight of her earlier doubts pressing heavily on her chest. Hayes, however, remained rooted to the spot, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. What did he just call you?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron turned to him, his expression as calm as ever. "Trump," he said simply, as if stating an unremarkable fact. Barron Trump. The weight of the name hung in the air, suffocating in its significance. Hayes felt the blood drain from his face as his mind reeled. He had spent the last 20 minutes interrogating and humiliating the youngest son of the most powerful man in the country. The gravity of his actions hit him like a physical blow. I didn't know," Hayes stammered, his arrogance crumbling into panic. "If I'd known, You'd have treated me differently?" Barron interrupted, his voice cutting through Hayes's excuses like a blade. There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet firmness that made the question all the more devastating. Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face reddening with a mix of shame and fear. Claudia, meanwhile, stepped forward, her voice tentative. "Mr. Trump," she said softly, "we truly didn't know. If there was any misunderstanding, I apologize." Barron's gaze shifted to her, his expression softening slightly. He gave her a small nod, but said nothing, his silence more eloquent than any words could have been. The sound of another car door closing drew everyone's attention back to the tarmac. From the second SUV emerged Donald Trump himself, his unmistakable silhouette framed by the glow of the setting sun. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, he moved with the authority of a man accustomed to command. His face, usually carefully controlled, was set in a hard, grim expression as he approached the jet. The atmosphere inside the cabin grew electric with tension. Passengers whispered furiously among themselves, their earlier dismissal of Barron now replaced with awe and apprehension. Hayes stood frozen, his heart pounding as Trump ascended the staircase and stepped into the cabin. The former president's eyes immediately found Barron. For a moment, his expression softened, a flicker of concern crossing his face as he took in his son's calm yet composed demeanor. Then his gaze shifted to Hayes, and the softness vanished, replaced by cold, calculated anger. "You," Trump said, his voice low and steady, yet carrying the weight of absolute authority, "are you the one who questioned my son's presence?" Hayes opened his mouth, his words stumbling out in a desperate attempt to explain. "Mr. Trump, there was a misunderstanding. I didn't know." Trump raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "You didn't know because you didn't care to ask," he said sharply. "Instead, you judged him, you humiliated him, and you assumed he didn't belong." The words hit Hayes like a series of punches, each one stripping away the last remnants of his arrogance. He tried to protest, but Trump's glare stopped him cold. "I've seen men like you before," Trump continued, his voice hardening. "You think you can treat people however you want because you hold a position of power. But here's the thing, you're replaceable. My son isn't." Barron watched the exchange in silence, his face unreadable. He had grown used to moments like these, where his father's presence turned the tides of every situation. Yet this time there was a sense of finality in Trump's tone that even Barron hadn't expected. Turning to one of the Secret Service agents, Trump said, "Make sure his name is on every blacklist for private aviation. He won't be flying for anyone after today." Hayes's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Please, Mr. Trump," he begged, his earlier confidence now shattered. "It was a mistake. You didn't mean to get caught," Trump snapped. "Now get off my plane." The finality of the command left no room for argument. Hayes turned to leave, his steps unsteady as he descended the staircase and disappeared into the fading light. Claudia stood silently, her eyes fixed on the ground, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Trump turned back to Barron, his expression softening once more. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. Barron nodded, his calm demeanor finally giving way to a faint smile. "I'm fine, Dad. Thanks for coming." Trump placed a hand on his son's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "No one disrespects my family," he said quietly. "Not while I'm around." As the tension in the cabin began to dissipate, Barron leaned back in his seat, his earlier composure returning. He glanced out the window, watching as the SUVs began to pull away. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered, a stark reminder of the power of judgment and the swiftness of justice. The cabin was eerily silent after Captain Hayes's departure. The sound of his retreating footsteps down the staircase lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the spectacle. The passengers, many of whom had dismissed Barron earlier, sat stiffly in their plush seats, their postures betraying unease. Claudia stood near the galley, her polished professionalism now strained under the weight of what had transpired. Barron remained seated, his expression calm but introspective. His hands rested lightly on his lap, his notebook now closed and tucked neatly into his backpack. Despite the resolution of the immediate conflict, a quiet tension hung over the cabin like a storm cloud, refusing to dissipate. Donald Trump took his seat across from Barron, his sharp eyes scanning the cabin. His presence, though physically grounded, seemed to fill every corner of the space, demanding attention and respect. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low yet commanding as he addressed Claudia. "Tell the remaining staff to prepare for departure," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Claudia nodded quickly, her usual poise faltering under his gaze. "Yes, Mr. Trump," she said, hurrying toward the cockpit to relay the order. As she disappeared, Trump turned his attention back to Barron. For a moment, the stern lines of his face softened, replaced by something almost paternal. "You handled that well," he said, his voice quieter now, almost approving. Barron met his father's gaze, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "I've dealt with worse," he replied simply. Trump's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You shouldn't have to," he said. The words carried a weight that transcended the immediate situation, a father's frustration at a world that often judged his son before knowing him. The jet began to hum with life as the engines powered up, their low vibration reverberating through the cabin. Claudia returned, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes betrayed lingering unease. She approached Barron hesitantly, as if unsure how to proceed. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice tentative, "I want to apologize again for the way things were handled earlier. It was unprofessional and unfair." Barron studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, his response measured. "Thank you," he said, his tone carrying neither forgiveness nor resentment. It was a simple acknowledgement, nothing more. Claudia seemed to relax slightly, though the tension in her shoulders didn't fully disappear. She retreated to the galley, leaving father and son alone in the cabin. As the jet taxied toward the runway, the passengers' whispers grew louder. Snippets of conversation drifted through the air, their tones ranging from incredulous to apologetic. "Can you believe it? That was Barron Trump. Who would have thought? He didn't even act like it. I feel awful for assuming." Their words reached Barron's ears, but he didn't react. He had grown accustomed to being underestimated, judged not by his actions, but by the shadows of expectations that loomed over him. This wasn't the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Trump, however, was less forgiving. His sharp gaze swept over the passengers, silencing their murmurs with a single look. "If any of you have something to say," he said, his voice cutting through the cabin like a blade, "say it now." The passengers froze, their whispers dying instantly. No one dared to meet his eyes, their earlier bravado replaced with discomfort. Satisfied, Trump leaned back in his seat, his expression one of cold satisfaction. As the jet lifted off the runway, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. The soft glow of the cabin lights cast long shadows, amplifying the subdued atmosphere. Barron stared out the window, watching as the city lights below grew smaller, their brilliance dimmed by distance. Trump broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just about you, Barron," he said, his tone measured. "It's about the principle. People like that pilot think they can get away with treating others like they're less than human because they assume no one will call them out. But you called him out, and you did it with dignity." Barron turned to his father, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't do it to make a point," he said quietly. "I just wanted to be left alone." Trump nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Sometimes making a point happens whether you intend it to or not." The flight attendant returned to check on them, her movements hesitant. She offered Trump a drink, which he declined, and then turned to Barron. "Would you like anything, Mr. Trump?" she asked, her tone more respectful now. Barron shook his head. "I'm fine, thank you." She lingered for a moment, as if contemplating whether to say more before retreating again. Her demeanor, like that of the entire cabin crew, had shifted, less dismissive, more deferential. The flight continued smoothly, the turbulence of the earlier confrontation fading into the background. Yet the impact of the events lingered in the air, a reminder of the fragility of assumptions and the power of presence. Barron resumed sketching in his notebook, the rhythmic scratch of his pen the only sound in the cabin. Trump watched him for a moment, his expression a mixture of pride and something deeper, perhaps regret for the world his son had to navigate. "You know," Trump said finally, his voice breaking the quiet, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone, not me, not them." Barron looked up, his eyes meeting his father's. "I know," he said, "but that doesn't mean they'll stop trying to test me." Trump's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding, a father and son bound not just by blood, but by the shared burden of living under the weight of their name. As the jet soared higher into the night, leaving the chaos of the ground behind, Barron returned to his sketches, the faintest smile playing on his lips. For now he had found peace, even if only for a fleeting moment. The jet glided through the starlit sky, the hum of its engines a steady backdrop to the heavy silence in the cabin. Though the confrontation on the ground had ended, its reverberations lingered, unspoken yet palpable in every corner of the aircraft. The passengers sat stiffly in their seats, their earlier chatter subdued, replaced by furtive glances toward Barron and his father. Barron, seated near the rear, appeared unbothered by the tension. His notebook lay open in his lap, the pages filling slowly with precise, intricate lines. He worked methodically, his focus unwavering, as if the events of the last hour were already a distant memory. But the faint furrow in his brow betrayed his inner thoughts, a quiet processing of what had transpired. Donald Trump sat across from him, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on his son. His sharp features were etched with a mixture of pride and something deeper, a protective resolve that seemed to harden with each passing moment. The silence was broken by a sudden knock at the cockpit door. Claudia, the flight attendant, stood hesitantly just inside the galley, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had been wrestling with the weight of her role in the earlier altercation, the memory of her initial skepticism toward Barron now a source of quiet shame. "Excuse me, Mr. Trump," she began softly, her voice careful. "May I speak with you?" Trump turned his steely gaze on her, his expression unreadable. "Go on." Claudia swallowed hard, her throat dry. I wanted to apologize again for what happened earlier. I should have trusted that he belonged here. I should have spoken up sooner." Trump's piercing stare lingered on her for a moment longer before he nodded curtly. "You're not the one who needs to apologize," he said, his tone firm. "But I'll take it under consideration." Claudia nodded, relief flickering briefly across her face. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly, retreating back toward the galley. The flight continued in uneasy quiet, the tension punctuated only by the occasional rustle of papers or the faint clink of glasses. Barron remained engrossed in his notebook, his pen moving with steady precision. Across from him, Trump's phone vibrated softly on the table. He picked it up, his expression tightening as he read the screen. "What is it?" Barron asked without looking up, sensing his father's shift in demeanor. Trump's voice was measured but firm. "It's Hayes. He's trying to contact the airline's board to plead his case." Barron set down his pen, his gaze steady. And, Trump continued, "he's finding that doors are closing faster than he can knock on them." There was no satisfaction in Trump's tone, only a matter-of-fact resolve. He placed the phone back on the table, leaning back in his seat with a thoughtful expression. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the new pilot, a seasoned professional named Captain Miller, adjusted the controls with practiced ease. He had been briefed on the incident before taking over and had silently vowed to ensure the rest of the flight proceeded without issue. Despite his composed exterior, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The intercom crackled softly as Miller addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. You may now move about the cabin. We're expecting a smooth flight to our destination." The announcement seemed to break some of the tension, and a few passengers shifted in their seats, their stiff postures relaxing slightly. But for Barron and Trump, the moment passed unnoticed, their focus inward. As the flight continued, a small gesture of redemption unfolded. Claudia returned to the rear of the cabin, a tray balanced carefully in her hands. She approached Barron, her steps measured, her expression tentative. "Mr. Trump," she said softly, addressing Barron directly for the first time, "I thought you might like some hot chocolate. I noticed you didn't eat earlier." Barron glanced up, his surprise evident. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before nodding. "Thank you," he said quietly, accepting the cup. Claudia hesitated, as if considering whether to say more. Finally, she added, "For what it's worth, I admire how you handled everything. You didn't let him get to you." Barron's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "I've had practice," he said simply. Claudia nodded, her respect for the young man deepening. She stepped back, giving him space, and returned to her duties with a lighter step. Trump watched the interaction silently, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed his son. When Claudia was gone, he leaned forward, his voice low. "You're handling this better than most adults would." Barron shrugged, his attention returning to his notebook. "It's not the first time someone's underestimated me. It won't be the last." Trump's gaze lingered on his son, a rare softness in his expression. "You've grown up faster than I wanted you to," he said quietly, "but you've done it with more grace than most people twice your age." Barron didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "You don't get to choose the lessons life teaches you. You just learn them." Trump leaned back, his lips curving into a faint smile. "You're wiser than you look, kid." As the jet neared its destination, the tension in the cabin finally began to dissipate. The events of the flight had left a mark on everyone aboard, a lesson in judgment and resilience that wouldn't soon be forgotten. For Barron, the journey had been another chapter in a life defined by expectations and assumptions. But as he gazed out the window at the twinkling lights below, he felt a quiet resolve settle within him. He would continue to face these challenges with the same quiet strength, knowing that his actions, not others' assumptions, defined who he was. The jet's engines roared softly as it began its descent. Outside, the dark expanse of the night sky gave way to the glittering lights of a sprawling city below. The cabin lights dimmed, bathing the space in a soft golden glow that highlighted the tension still hanging in the air. Barron sat quietly by the window, his notebook closed and tucked away in his backpack. His gaze was fixed on the shimmering cityscape below, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the flight. The sting of Hayes's earlier condescension lingered, not because of the words themselves, but because they were a reminder of how easily people judged him. His calm exterior was intact, but beneath it a quiet storm brewed. Donald Trump, seated across from Barron, watched his son closely. Though Barron's posture was relaxed, Trump could see the subtle signs of tension, the way his fingers drummed lightly against the armrest, the way his gaze lingered too long on the passing lights. Trump leaned forward, breaking the silence. "You're thinking about what happened," he said, his tone low and steady. Barron turned his head slightly, meeting his father's eyes. "It's hard not to," he admitted. "I know people like Hayes exist, but it doesn't make it any easier when it happens." Trump nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You handled it better than most would, but I won't pretend it's fair or right that you had to." Barron looked away, his eyes returning to the window. "I just don't get why people feel the need to judge before they know anything." Trump's voice softened, a rare vulnerability creeping into his tone. "It's easier for them. Judging someone lets them put people into boxes. It makes them feel in control." Barron considered this, his brow furrowing. "But it's so small-minded." "It is," Trump agreed, "but it's also why you need to be bigger than them, not just in what you say, but in how you carry yourself." As the jet approached the runway, Claudia entered the cabin with her usual composure, though her movements were more subdued than before. She stopped near Barron, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Mr. Trump," she said hesitantly, addressing Donald, "the landing is expected to be smooth. Is there anything I can do for you or your son before we arrive?" Trump shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "We're fine." Claudia nodded, then turned to Barron. "I just want to say again, I'm sorry for earlier. I should have trusted you were here for a reason." Barron met her eyes, his expression calm. "Thank you," he said simply. Claudia hesitated, then added, "If there's anything I can do to make up for it." Barron shook his head. "You don't need to. You were doing your job." Her eyes widened slightly at his graciousness, and she nodded, retreating to the galley. Trump watched her go, his lips curving into a faint, approving smile. "You're learning the art of diplomacy," he remarked. Barron gave a small shrug. "Sometimes it's easier than holding on to things." The jet touched down with a gentle jolt, its wheels gliding across the tarmac. Outside, the airport was alive with activity, a flurry of lights and motion that stood in stark contrast to the quiet tension inside the cabin. The engines whined softly as the plane slowed, and the passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings with a mix of relief and subdued energy. As the jet taxied to its private hangar, a new convoy of black SUVs waited nearby, their headlights piercing the darkness. Barron glanced out the window, watching the vehicles approach, and felt a familiar pang of longing for anonymity. The sight of the security detail, while comforting, was also a stark reminder of the life he couldn't escape. The cabin door opened with a soft hiss, and the cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint scent of jet fuel. Secret Service agents entered first, their movements efficient and deliberate as they secured the area. One agent approached Trump, speaking in low tones, and Trump nodded in acknowledgement. "Let's go," Trump said to Barron, rising from his seat. Barron stood, slipping his backpack over his shoulder. Together, they made their way toward the door, the eyes of every passenger following their movements. Some of the passengers offered hesitant nods of acknowledgement, while others avoided eye contact, their earlier judgments now sources of quiet embarrassment. As they stepped onto the staircase leading to the tarmac, the cool air hit Barron's face, refreshing but sobering. The convoy of SUVs waited just a few steps away, their doors open, agents standing ready. Before entering the car, Trump paused, turning to Barron. "Do you want to say anything to them?" he asked, gesturing subtly toward the passengers who had gathered near the cabin's entrance. Barron considered it, his gaze sweeping over the group. He saw their unease, their attempts to appear nonchalant despite the guilt etched on their faces. Finally, he shook his head. "They already know," he said simply. Trump's expression softened, and he gave a small nod. "Good," The father and son entered the waiting SUV, the door closing behind them with a soft thud. As the convoy pulled away from the hangar, Barron leaned back in his seat, staring out the window at the receding lights of the airport. Trump glanced at him, his voice breaking the quiet. "You did well today." Barron looked at him, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Thanks." The car sped into the night, leaving the airport behind. Though the day had been marked by judgment and tension, Barron felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He hadn't chosen this life, but he would face it on his own terms, with the same quiet strength that had carried him through this flight. And in the distance, the city lights shimmered like a promise, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice, there was always the potential for something greater. A gentle breeze drifted through the slightly open car window, carrying with it the earthy scent of rain-soaked ground. Barron leaned his head against the cool glass, his gaze fixed on the kaleidoscope of city lights dancing outside. Beside him, Donald Trump sat in silence, his phone resting in his hand but untouched. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, the weight of the day evident in his posture. The car ride home was enveloped in a thick silence, broken only by the muted hum of the engine. For Barron, the echoes of the day's events played over in his mind, like a reel he couldn't stop. Hayes's disdainful words still lingered, not because they hurt, but because they served as a stark reminder of the prejudice he often encountered. His face remained calm, but the storm within churned, quietly but relentlessly. "I'm not angry at them," Barron said suddenly, breaking the stillness. His voice was soft, contemplative. "I'm just tired of having to prove myself over and over." Trump turned his head slightly, studying his son. His sharp eyes, usually so commanding, softened. "Anger isn't your weapon, Barron. What you showed today, that calmness, that restraint, is what truly disarms people." Barron nodded but didn't respond. His thoughts were still tangled with the questions that often haunted him. Why were people so quick to judge? Why were assumptions so deeply ingrained? As the SUV pulled into the driveway of their estate, the headlights illuminated a small group of reporters lingering beyond the gates. Their cameras flashed intermittently, seeking a glimpse of the Trumps. Barron sighed softly, not surprised, but still weary of the constant attention. "Go inside," Trump said, his tone firm but not harsh. "I'll deal with them." Barron stepped out of the car, the chill night air brushing against his face. He walked toward the house, his footsteps steady but his mind restless. Inside, the grand hall was quiet, the familiar stillness offering a temporary reprieve. He sank into one of the plush chairs, the weight of the day finally pressing down on him. Not long after, Melania Trump entered the room, her silk dress flowing gracefully as she moved. She sat down beside Barron, her kind eyes searching his face. "Your father said it's been handled," she began gently, "but I want to hear it from you. Are you all right?" Barron hesitated for a moment, then began recounting the events of the flight. He spoke of Hayes's harsh words, Claudia's conflicted demeanor, and the passengers' silent judgment. When he reached the part about calling his father, a small, knowing smile tugged at Melania's lips. "You handled it well," she said, her voice warm. "But how do you feel about it?" Barron looked down at his hands, then back at his mother. "I feel like they need to change, not because I'm Barron Trump, but because no one deserves to be treated like that, no matter who they are." Melania nodded, her pride evident in her expression. "Then hold on to that, Barron. It's not just about standing up for yourself. It's about making the world a little better for everyone." As they spoke, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the hall. Donald Trump entered, his presence as commanding as ever, though there was a weariness in his step. "It's done," he announced, sitting down across from Barron. "Hayes won't be flying for anyone anymore, and I've told the airline board to conduct mandatory training on prejudice and customer treatment." Barron looked up, surprised. "And they agreed?" Trump smirked, his confidence unwavering. When the person paying their salaries makes a demand, They don't have much choice. Barron allowed a small smile to form, a flicker of relief easing the tension in his shoulders. It wasn't just a personal victory, it was a step towards something larger. Later that night, as the house settled into quiet, Barron sat by the window in his room. The moonlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating the notebook in his lap. On the page he had drawn the outline of a plane soaring through a starry sky. Beneath it, in neat handwriting, he wrote, "People won't always be fair, but you can choose how you face them. Calmness is strength." He closed the notebook and gazed out at the city lights, which twinkled like tiny beacons in the distance. Despite the challenges of the day, a quiet sense of peace settled over him. He knew that this wasn't the end of the journey, but he also knew he was ready for whatever came next. And as the city slept, Barron Trump sat by the window, resolved to face the world with the same quiet strength that had carried him this far. This story reminds us how dangerous it is to judge someone without knowing their story. Actions rooted in arrogance and prejudice often come back to haunt us in ways we least expect. Barron's quiet strength and composure proved that sometimes the best response isn't loud or dramatic, it's letting the truth speak for itself. If this story moved you, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss more powerful stories like this. Your support helps share these important lessons with even more people. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.